This lesson will cover Chapter 13 on the Presidency. It is no doubt that presidential elections garner the most attention. The first aspect of a presidential election is the primary, and primaries happen in each of the states all over the country. Once the presidential nominee is decided upon of that political party, delegates go to national conventions and vote for those nominees at each of the political party conventions. Votes in the general election determine which candidates' electors will cast their ballots. This runs on the Electoral College, and there are 538 electors in the Electoral College. That represents 435 representatives from each of the districts, 100 senators, and 3 representatives from the District of Columbia. Presidents wear many different hats. The next thing we'll talk about are all of the presidential roles that the president fills. The first role the president plays is chief legislator. What that means is they play a part in the policymaking process. Although they head the executive branch, it is also necessary for them to sign a bill into law or veto it, thus making them a significant part of the legislative process. In addition to formally signing a bill into law or vetoing a law, the President can also lobby Congress members to support or oppose pending legislation. In addition, the President is expected to give a formal speech in the State of the Union every year, and in that State of the Union, they often lay out congressional agendas. They place pressure on Congress to pay attention to specific issues and prioritize certain policies. The President also submits the annual budget for the federal government, and even though this is just a proposal, it still places a lot of pressure on Congress to adhere to it. One of the most significant roles that the President has in policymaking is signing a bill into law or vetoing that law. Now, we've talked about the number of ways that bills can either become law or be vetoed, but we don't need to get into that right now for the sake of time. One thing that you ought to be familiar with is the line item veto. Now keep in mind, I cannot stress this enough. This is not a constitutional practice or power of the president. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1997. You want to know what it is? You want to know it existed, but you also want to know it's unconstitutional. Do not invoke this as one of your examples. You will lose points on the AP exam if you do. So what is the line item veto? It was only in practice during President Clinton's administration, and it was invoked 82 times. It is the power of the president to strike out a specific line item on an appropriations bill while allowing the rest of the bill to become law. Now you can see why this would be a huge expansion of the president's power in policymaking, which makes sense as to why it was ruled unconstitutional. But this allowed for the president to easily cross out parts of bills that they did not want to be funded, for example, or did not want to appropriate the funding for without throwing out the entire bill. Again, can't stress enough, unconstitutional, not a practice that happens today, but it did happen for a short period of time during Clinton's administration. Now, one of the primary determinants of whether a president will regularly exercise veto power is whether the president's party has a majority in Congress. So, for example, Obama vetoed more when Republicans controlled Congress. When a president signs a bill into law, they also issue that with a signing statement. So today, presidents use the signing statement to influence how politics are administered. And in this signing statement, it's a written message that the president issues upon signing a bill into law. That could be really controversial. Sometimes these signing statements might come with terms or conditions, or may even reshape how a bill ought to be interpreted or understood. In addition to the president being seen as a chief legislator, the president is also seen as a chief economist. You will see some overlap here, but the key presidential role as the economist is managing the economy and submitting a budget to Congress. Submitting a budget can allow presidents to control where federal tax dollars are spent. and it can also set economic priorities of the legislative agenda. The president also establishes regulatory and economic environments in which business must operate. So the president can very much influence economic growth and employment levels. One of the most significant institutions that dictates what happens in the US economy is the Federal Reserve Board, and the president plays a major role in driving what that Federal Reserve Board looks like. The president appoints the Federal Reserve Board and its chair, and the way that this Federal Reserve Board looks may influence consumer confidence and support from economically influential individuals on Wall Street. This is why the president may choose more moderate and less partisan individuals to maintain that confidence on Wall Street. In addition to being chief legislator, chief economist, the president is also the party leader, the figurehead, the face of the party. The president selects the national party chair and is the most influential leading fundraiser. The president plays an important role in promoting the re-election of candidates from their party by ensuring enough money is available for their campaigns. The president also acts as the party head in daily operations of the executive branch, and when the president's term ends, they also will likely campaign on behalf of the party's new presidential nominee. So they always remain attached to, and in some way, a symbolic leader, even when they're not in office. Now that we've looked at the president and their roles in the domestic sphere, we can look at the presidential roles in the foreign policy sphere. The president serves as the chief diplomat. They shape and administer the nation's foreign policy. They're supported by foreign policy resources like the State Department, the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, and branches of the U.S. military. Now, it is important to note that Congress is more likely to challenge domestic policy when it comes to the president and much less likely to challenge the president when it comes to foreign policy. For the most part, they leave the president alone. They may be critical of the president and their stance on foreign policy, but because the general public also pays less attention, it may be no surprise that Congress doesn't give it much attention either. The president also is in charge of international agreements, so they negotiate treaties and other international agreements with foreign nations and represent the United States in international summits. This means a lot of travel to foreign nations to meet with other world leaders. The president can also create executive agreements. This is an international agreement between the United States and other nations, not subject to Senate approval, and in effect only during the administration of the president who negotiates the agreement. So let's contrast that with a formal treaty. A treaty is something that needs Senate approval. This means that it will be honored even after that president leaves office. An executive agreement, on the other hand, can be nullified by the next administration that comes into power and the president that comes into power. An example of this would have been the Paris Climate Agreement. President Obama entered that agreement without senatorial approval. President Trump nullified that and came out of the agreement, or pulled out of the agreement, and then President Biden is looking to re-enter that agreement. Another role is choosing ambassadors. The president can appoint ambassadors to other nations, and ambassadors are official U.S. representatives in their host nation. The responsibilities depend on the locale of their appointment, so where it is they end up being a representative of and where what country they are an ambassador to. And the president is the leader of the diplomatic corps, hosting state dinners at the White House, and formally receives ambassadors of other nations as well. So when they come to visit and they're schmoozed, that is the president's responsibility. One of the most important roles of the president is the role of commander-in-chief. And what this means is the president is the supreme military commander of the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. This is a major reason that presidents are preferred to have military experience, which to an extent makes sense. If a president is expected to be the supreme military commander, then one would also expect that they have that experience. There are only 13 presidents that have not served in the military. So that also speaks to how significant and important it is considered. Presidents typically are considered stronger candidates when they have military experience and they also have served as governor because that means that they've had executive experience. All right, more roles of the president. The president is also seen as the chief executive. They appoint all the secretaries or top administrators of the cabinet and heads of other federal government agencies that develop and implement the administration's policy. The president also appoints other staff members and advisors, and they determine how the bureaucracy will implement laws Congress has passed and which policies are emphasized. This has everything to do with how laws are being enforced, and there is a lot of flexibility and freedom and insulation that all of these bureaucratic agencies have after they're given directives through bills that Congress passes. Last role, Chief of State. This ultimately embodies the president as the figurehead of the country. So the president embodies the values and ideals of the nation, both within the United States and abroad. You might compare this role to the ceremonial role played by a constitutional monarch in parliamentary systems. This role in particular is probably what leads the country as well as the world to believe that this is the most significant position in a country. But the president plays the role of a symbolic leader of the United States and enhances the president's image and authority and promotes national unity. Next, we'll specifically talk about the president and the executive branch. So the executive branch is far more extensive than just the president and the vice president and cabinet members. It also includes all of these different agencies that are responsible for enforcing the law. Just a little recap from the 12th Amendment. Remember, the president and vice president were initially selected by the president being elected. Whoever was in first place became president, and whoever was in second place became vice president. Super awkward. 12th Amendment changed that, where the president now ran with a running mate who was the vice president, and they ran on the same ticket. So this brings us to the concept of a balanced ticket. If a president is trying to garner as much support as possible, what they may lack in experience, character, relatability, they might look for in a vice presidential running mate. That vice presidential running mate offers a diversity of ideology. Maybe they come from a different geographic region that they might appeal to. Maybe their age comes into play, gender, race, or ethnicity. This broadens the president's appeal to the electorate and increases their chances of getting elected. So what is the role of the vice president? For the most part, they also are required to fill the same qualifications. They're first in line for the presidency, so that makes sense. Their role is largely ceremonial, so if the president cannot fulfill the responsibilities of maybe traveling to foreign nations or serving as the chief diplomat, a lot of the time this is where the vice president may come into play, and oftentimes they make up for the shortcomings of their running mate, basically presidential candidates. Remember back in grade school when you learned about the executive and you learned that the cabinet advises the president? What does that mean? The cabinet serves as the heads of each executive department. So basically we're looking at the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Education. All of these individuals that are more specialized and experts in their areas can help advise the president in what they should prioritize, be concerned with, be paying attention to, because let's be honest, they can't be experts in everything. In addition to the cabinet, the president is also advised by the executive office of the president. So what does this look like? They're the launching pad for the implementation of policy. They help the president carry out the day-to-day responsibilities of the presidency and assist the first lady and vice president in their official activities. And they also coordinate policies among different agencies and departments. The president does not need senatorial approval for the executive office. The White House office is more directly affiliated with the president, and this includes the chief of staff, the press secretary, and the White House counsel. I'll go into detail with this in the next part.